There are moments in a courtroom where no one breathes. Not because they are told not to, but because something about the air itself feels heavier than sound. This was one of those moments. A woman sat in the witness box. Still. Composed. But not untouched. Her fingers were pressed together tightly, too tightly for someone who claimed she had nothing to hide. Across the room, the man she once called her husband sat completely still. Not reacting. Not moving. But watching her like he already knew what was coming. And then the question was asked. Simple. Direct. Final. Did you know the truth about him before you married him? The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded. Because everyone in that room understood something at the same time. This was not just a question. It was a turning point. The kind that divides a story into two versions. Before the answer, and after it. She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes dropped. Not in fear exactly, but in something closer to calculation. As if she had already answered this question before. Just not out loud. Seconds passed. Then more. A cough somewhere in the back of the room was quickly suppressed. A pen stopped moving mid-note. Even the judge shifted slightly forward, almost without realizing it. And still, she said nothing. For a brief moment, it almost felt like she was somewhere else entirely. Not in a courtroom. Not in the present. But inside something older. Something unfinished. Because the question didn't just demand truth. It demanded alignment between memory and consequence. And those two things rarely sit comfortably together. Her breathing was steady. Too steady. The kind of control people develop when they have already decided what they're going to say. But are measuring what it will cost them. Across the room, the man moved slightly. Just enough to be noticed. Not nervous. Not reactive. But attentive. As if he wasn't waiting for her answer, but for her decision. Finally, she lifted her head. Not toward the lawyer. Not toward the judge. But toward him. And for the first time, the emotional structure of the room shifted. Because whatever existed between them was not unknown. It was unspoken. And now it was about to be acknowledged. Her lips parted. A breath in. A moment where everything paused again. And then. Yes. One word. No explanation. No defense. No hesitation. Just confirmation. At first, no one moved. Because the brain resists clarity when it arrives too quickly. It needs time to adjust. Then it started. A shift in posture. A glance exchanged between jurors. A quiet murmur from the gallery. Someone whispered something under their breath that no one repeated out loud. Because the meaning of that single word had already spread faster than explanation could contain it. This was not what they expected. This was not the narrative they had prepared for. She was not supposed to answer like that. But the most important reaction came from him. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look angry. He looked like someone whose private understanding had just been confirmed in public. And that is far more dangerous than surprise. Because surprise suggests ignorance. But recognition suggests shared history. He didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He simply looked at her. Not as someone hearing something new, but as someone hearing something they had already lived through. In that moment, yes stopped being a simple answer. It became a shift in meaning. Because it confirmed something deeper. She was not speaking from distance. She was speaking from involvement. And that changed the emotional structure of the entire case. Because now the question was no longer, was she deceived? It became, what did she already know, and when did she choose to accept it? Up until this moment, the case had been framed in one direction. A woman caught in a relationship built on hidden truths. A man accused of withholding parts of his identity. A narrative built on imbalance of knowledge. But imbalance requires innocence on one side. And that innocence had just become uncertain. Not erased. Not disproven. But complicated. And complications are what make stories difficult to resolve cleanly. Because she did not look like a victim in that moment. But she also did not look like someone in control. She looked like someone standing in the space between two truths. What she knew. And what she allowed herself to live with. That is what made the courtroom uncomfortable. Not guilt. Not accusation. But ambiguity. He still did not speak. But his silence had changed meaning. Before the answer, it was uncertainty. After the answer, it was recognition. Because something unspoken between them had just been acknowledged in front of everyone else. And once something private becomes public, it cannot return to what it was before. In most stories, this is where clarity begins. But here, clarity does not arrive. Instead, responsibility begins to split. Because if she knew, then the story is no longer about what was hidden from her. It becomes about what she chose to remain inside of. And that is a far more uncomfortable question. The courtroom remained still. But the story had already moved. Because one word had changed the direction of everything that followed. And now, the question was no longer what he did, or what she knew, but why she stayed. Sometimes the truth does not end a story. It reveals who chose to remain in it. After the courtroom's silence broke, nothing returned to normal. Not immediately. Not cleanly. Not in the way people expect when a single answer is given. Because truth, once spoken in a public space, does not stay contained within that moment. It spreads. It reinterprets everything it touches. And in this case, it began with a word that should have been simple. Yes. That was all she said. But what followed was not simplicity. It was interpretation. Within hours, the story had already begun to change shape outside the courtroom. Not through official statements, not through verified documents, but through people trying to make sense of what they had heard. Because when facts are incomplete, the human mind does something predictable. It fills the gaps. And what it fills them with says more about the audience than the event itself. By the next day, headlines began to form. Not identical, not consistent, but aligned in one direction. She was being described in ways that reduced complexity into familiarity. A woman misled. A partner caught in something she did not fully understand. Someone who had entered a relationship without knowing the full picture. It was the version that made people feel comfortable. Because it placed responsibility in a clear location. Not with her. Not fully. Human beings are not naturally drawn to complexity when emotion is involved. They prefer structure. They prefer clarity. They prefer narratives where roles are defined. Victim. Deceiver. Witness. Perpetrator. The moment those roles become blurred, discomfort begins. And discomfort demands resolution. So the public did what it always does. It chose the simplest interpretation that still made emotional sense. She was not someone who knowingly stayed. She was someone who had been kept in the dark. At least, that was the version that spread fastest. As attention expanded, focus shifted toward him. The husband. The man who had been present in the courtroom but absent in emotional commentary. The man who did not interrupt. Did not argue. Did not react in ways that could be easily interpreted. Public perception quickly began to construct him as something specific. Not necessarily evil. Not necessarily innocent. But unreadable. Controlled. Distant. A man whose emotional expression did not match public expectation. And that alone was enough for interpretation to begin. Because in stories like this, silence is rarely treated as neutrality. It is treated as meaning waiting to be decoded. But there was a contradiction that began to emerge almost immediately. Because the more people tried to define him, the less consistent the definition became. To some, he was manipulative. To others, he was private. To others still, he was misunderstood. And none of those interpretations could fully override the others. Because there was no single action that definitively anchored him into one category. There was only perception. And perception is unstable when evidence is incomplete. As discussion continued online and offline, something else began to happen. A shift in emotional alignment. People did not just want to understand the case. They wanted to assign emotional positioning. And in most cases, that positioning favored her. Because it felt morally easier. It felt socially familiar. It aligned with a narrative that is often seen in relationships under public scrutiny. A woman caught in a situation she did not create. But that narrative had already been complicated by her own testimony. And that complication made people uncomfortable. So instead of adjusting the narrative, they refined it. They softened it. They reshaped it into something easier to hold. By the time commentary reached broader audiences, the framing had become more structured. News outlets and discussion panels began repeating similar interpretations. A relationship built on imbalance. A husband withholding truth. A partner struggling to understand what she had entered into. The story was becoming familiar again. Because familiarity sells understanding. And understanding sells attention. But underneath that framing, something important was being quietly ignored. The fact that her answer had not suggested ignorance. It had suggested acknowledgement. And yet, one question continued to surface in quieter conversations. Less in headlines. More in discussions that were less concerned with certainty. If she knew, why did she continue? That question did not fit comfortably into either narrative. Not the victim narrative. Not the deception narrative. Because it implied agency. And agency complicates emotional alignment. So instead of answering it directly, most interpretations avoided it. They redirected attention elsewhere. To him. To evidence. To missing information. Anywhere except the contradiction that could not be easily resolved. Meanwhile, attention toward him continued to intensify. But the more people looked for emotional extremes, the less they found. He did not present himself in ways that aligned with public expectation of guilt or innocence. There were no exaggerated reactions. No visible attempts to sway perception. No emotional collapse that could be used as interpretive evidence. Instead, there was consistency. And consistency is difficult to interpret when emotion is the lens. Because it does not confirm assumptions. It resists them. This created a widening gap in interpretation. On one side, there was emotional narrative. On the other, behavioral ambiguity. And in between them, a space where neither explanation fully satisfied the audience. Because emotional storytelling depends on alignment. But this case did not align cleanly. It resisted classification. And resistance creates tension. After the courtroom moment, she did not provide further explanation. No immediate clarification. No attempt to adjust public interpretation. No additional statements that would simplify the contradiction. And that absence became its own form of narrative material. Because when people do not explain themselves, others do it for them. And those explanations are rarely neutral. Eventually, a version of consensus began to form. Not officially, but socially. She was viewed with sympathy. He was viewed with uncertainty. The relationship was framed as asymmetrical in understanding. But underneath that consensus, the original contradiction remained unresolved. Because acknowledgement does not automatically equal explanation. And silence does not automatically equal innocence or guilt. And so the central question returned again. Stripped of interpretation, stripped of media framing, stripped of public comfort. If she knew, why did she continue? That question did not yet have a public answer. But it would become the foundation for everything that followed. Because the next phase of the story was not about discovery. It was about what happens when knowledge and choice exist in the same space. People don't react to truth itself. They react to the version of truth that allows them to feel most comfortable about what they believe. But there was one part of the story no one in the public narrative had fully explained yet. The man who disappeared. And why his absence still mattered more than anyone realized. Some people do not disappear in a dramatic way. There is no final argument. No public exit. No confirmed ending that marks a clean separation between presence and absence. Instead, they fade in a different way. Through missing records. Through unanswered questions. Through conversations that stop referencing them altogether. And over time, the absence becomes normal. That is what makes it dangerous. Because what is normalized is no longer questioned. For a long period of time, his name did not surface in any visible part of the case. Not in court testimony. Not in media summaries. Not in the public narrative that formed after the courtroom confession. It was as if he existed in a space just outside the frame of the story. Present enough to have mattered once. But absent enough to be ignored now. Until something changed. It arrived without context. No official origin. No verified chain of custody that could explain how it entered the investigation file. No clear indication of when it was written or how long it had existed before it was found. It simply appeared among collected personal materials. Folded. Kept. Not destroyed. Not forgotten. But preserved. As if someone believed it would eventually matter again. On the outside, there was only her name. Nothing else. No return address. No signature. No indication of authorship beyond what would be revealed inside. Inside was a single page. And on that page, only one sentence. You promised you'd never tell. No greeting. No explanation. No reference to time or place. Just that line. And yet, it did something that no formal statement had managed to do. It reopened a closed silence. When investigators reviewed the letter, they did not immediately assign it meaning. Because meaning requires context. And context, in this case, was fragmented. There was no confirmed timeline connecting the letter to any documented event. No official acknowledgement that such a promise had been made in a recorded setting. But the emotional weight of the sentence did not depend on documentation. It depended on recognition. And recognition, in cases like this, is often private before it becomes public. To reconstruct the significance of the letter, attention turned back to him. The man whose presence in the story had never been fully established in official narrative. Not because he was unknown, but because he was incomplete. He existed in fragments. A name mentioned once. A reference in a conversation. A memory described differently depending on who was recalling it. But never fully present in the current structure of events. And then, nothing. There was no official record of when he left her life. No confirmed date of separation. No documented final interaction that marked the end of their connection. Instead, there was only discontinuity. A point in time where references to him stopped appearing in her known timeline. And that discontinuity became accepted as normal. Because people rarely question silence that is already established. One of the most important discoveries in this phase of the investigation was not about him directly. It was about how absence forms. Because disappearance does not always require physical removal. Sometimes it only requires repeated non-reference. A slow withdrawal of acknowledgement. A gradual shift where someone stops being mentioned in conversations that once included them. And eventually, they become structurally invisible. Not gone, but unspoken. Investigators noted something important. No one had actively pursued answers about him in the immediate aftermath of the courtroom events. Not because he was irrelevant, but because attention had shifted elsewhere. Toward the husband. Toward the confession. Toward the question of knowledge and choice. And in that shift, the missing man became background noise in a story that was still unfolding. The letter disrupted that quiet structure. Because it introduced something that could not be ignored. A promise. You promised you'd never tell. That statement implied three things. That something was known. That something was agreed upon. And that silence had been intentionally maintained. But it also introduced a contradiction. Because there was no public record confirming what the promise referred to. Which meant the truth of it existed somewhere outside official visibility. In memory. In private conversation. In lived experience that had not been fully disclosed. This is where the investigation reached a critical tension. Because memory is not stable. It shifts over time. It adapts to emotional context. It reorganizes itself based on what a person is willing to carry forward. But silence is different. Silence does not change. It only accumulates. And when memory and silence interact over long periods, something important happens. The past becomes unclear not because it is gone, but because it has been repeatedly unspoken. As the letter circulated through investigative review, interpretations began to diverge. Some believed it pointed to an unresolved personal conflict. Others suggested it referenced a situation that had never been fully disclosed to authorities. And a smaller group of analysts raised a more difficult possibility. That the absence of the man in the narrative was not accidental, but the result of sustained omission. Not necessarily coordinated, but maintained over time, through silence that was never challenged. Naturally, attention returned to her. Because if the letter was authentic in meaning, then she was not simply a bystander to the missing narrative. She was part of its structure, not necessarily as an actor in every event, but as someone connected to what was remembered and what was not. And that distinction mattered, because participation in silence is still participation, even when no action is taken. There is a difference between forgetting and choosing not to speak. Forgetting removes memory from access, but silence keeps memory intact while refusing to release it. And that creates pressure over time. Pressure that does not always appear immediately, but builds slowly beneath every unanswered question. The reason the letter became central again was not because it provided answers. It did not. It did the opposite. It introduced a question that had not been fully allowed to exist in the public narrative. What exactly was being protected by silence? And who benefited from that silence remaining intact? Those questions did not have immediate answers, but they changed the direction of the investigation. Because now, the focus was no longer only on what was known. It was on what had been intentionally left unspoken. And as investigators traced earlier emotional and behavioral patterns, one conclusion began to emerge slowly. The man who disappeared was not fully absent from the story. He remained present in fragments, in timing, in references, in inconsistencies that had never been fully resolved. And the letter suggested that his absence was not the end of his relevance, but the beginning of a different kind of influence. One shaped not by presence, but by silence. Silence is not the absence of truth. It is often the presence of a decision made under pressure. But the deeper question remained unresolved. If silence protected something, what exactly was it protecting? And why had it lasted this long? Not all dangerous stories begin with danger. Some begin with relief, with quiet, with the absence of uncertainty that once defined everything before. And in this case, that is exactly how it started. Not with chaos, not with suspicion, but with something far more difficult to question. Stability. Before the relationship that would later become central to the case, her life, based on reconstructed accounts, was marked by inconsistency. Not necessarily crisis, but uncertainty in emotional patterns. Situations that did not fully resolve. Connections that did not fully stabilize. Moments that felt incomplete without explanation. Nothing dramatic enough to define a public narrative, but enough to shape private emotional memory. And that matters, because people do not measure emotional relief against perfection. They measure it against what came before. When he entered her life, the contrast was immediate. Not announced. Not explained. but felt. There was a consistency in his presence that did not demand interpretation. He did not appear unpredictable in his emotional expression. He did not create uncertainty through inconsistency. He simply remained steady. And in emotional psychology, steadiness is often interpreted as safety, even when it is not fully understood. According to behavioral patterns later reviewed in the case, the early phase of the relationship did not show signs of disruption. There were no documented conflicts of significant intensity. No visible instability in communication. No abrupt changes in emotional engagement. Instead, there was routine. Predictability. A rhythm that felt increasingly familiar over time. And familiarity, when paired with emotional relief, becomes powerful. Because it reduces internal tension. And people naturally move toward environments where tension decreases. It is important to understand something about emotional stability in relationships. It does not always feel like excitement. Sometimes it feels like quiet. Like reduced questioning. Like fewer internal alarms. And when someone has lived with emotional uncertainty before, that quiet can feel like healing. Even when it is simply absence of disruption. That distinction would later become important in how the relationship was interpreted. But at the time, there was no reason to question it. Because nothing was visibly wrong. Trust does not always begin with full transparency. In many cases, it begins with behavior. Consistency. Presence. Reliability in small actions. And over time, those repeated behaviors form an emotional baseline. A reference point. From there, everything else is measured. And in this case, that baseline began forming quickly. Early in the relationship, there were small gaps in information. Not dramatic enough to cause alarm. But present. He did not share detailed personal history easily. Certain topics were redirected rather than expanded upon. Some questions received partial answers instead of full explanations. At the time, these were not interpreted as warning signs. They were interpreted as privacy. And privacy is socially normalized. So it rarely triggers concern on its own. One of the key behavioral patterns observed in emotional attachment is selective acceptance. People do not evaluate relationships as complete data sets. They evaluate them through emotional balance. If the emotional experience is positive enough, missing information becomes less urgent. Not irrelevant. Just postponed. And postponement, over time, becomes habit. Within the reconstructed emotional timeline, he represented something specific. Not dominance. Not control. But reduction of emotional volatility. His presence was associated with fewer emotional extremes. Fewer confrontational moments. Fewer unpredictable shifts in relational tone. And that stability reinforced itself. Because the absence of conflict can feel like confirmation of compatibility. Sometimes it equals untested boundaries, unasked questions, unrevealed information. And what has not been tested cannot be assumed secure. That is the underlying tension that begins forming here, even if it is not yet fully acknowledged. And so, without visible disruption, the emotional landscape begins to change. Subtly, internally, questions begin to carry more weight than they did before. And silence begins to feel slightly different than it once did. Not comforting, but uncertain. And that shift marks the beginning of instability that has not yet surfaced externally. Comfort is not proof of truth. It is only proof of reduced questioning. And reduced questioning can sometimes delay clarity more effectively than conflict ever could. But comfort does not remain unchanged forever. Because eventually, questions stop staying quiet. And when they begin to surface, they come from outside the relationship itself. There is a moment in every seemingly stable story when the outside world refuses to stay outside. It does not arrive with permission. It does not ask whether it is welcome. It simply enters. And in doing so, it changes the emotional temperature of everything it touches. That is what happened here. Quietly. Without warning. It began on a day that, by all outward appearances, was unremarkable. No documented tension beforehand. No indication of imminent disruption. No visible shift in routine that would suggest anything unusual was about to occur. She was in a public space, moving through the day as she normally would. Nothing in her immediate environment suggested that the stability she had come to rely on was about to be questioned. And yet, history rarely announces itself before it changes direction. The encounter did not happen dramatically. There was no confrontation. No raised voice. No aggressive approach. Instead, it was subtle. A recognition. Someone noticing her presence in a way that suggested prior awareness rather than coincidence. At first, it may not have seemed significant. People are recognized in public all the time. But this recognition carried something different. Wait. The person spoke. And what they said was not framed as opinion. It was not a question. It was not uncertainty. It was a statement. You don't know who you married. There are sentences that do not need elaboration to create impact. This was one of them. Because it did not introduce new information directly. It introduced doubt. And doubt, once introduced into a stable system, begins to expand. Her initial reaction, according to reconstructed accounts, was not immediate acceptance. It was resistance. Not outward confrontation, but internal rejection of implication. Because the statement did not align with her lived experience of stability. It contradicted the emotional consistency she had come to trust. And when experience and external claims collide, the mind typically defends what it has built over time. One of the first thoughts that arises in moments like this is not about truth. It is about intention. Why would someone say this? What do they gain from introducing uncertainty into a relationship they are not part of? This is where intrusion and warning begin to overlap. Because the source of information becomes as important as the information itself. What made the statement more unsettling was what followed it. Nothing. No evidence was immediately provided. No documents were presented. No clear explanation was offered in the moment. Only the assertion remained. And assertions without context create emotional instability. Because they cannot be easily resolved. They linger. At this stage, something subtle began to change. Not in behavior. Not immediately. But in perception. Trust, which had previously been structured around consistency, now encountered contradiction. And once contradiction enters a stable belief system, certainty begins to weaken. Not collapse. Just weaken. From this point onward, the emotional structure becomes divided. On one side, the lived experience of stability, the emotional consistency of the relationship, the absence of visible disruption. On the other side, an external claim, a suggestion of unknown history, a possibility that something had been missed. And these two realities do not immediately reconcile. They coexist in tension. One of the most psychologically important aspects of this moment is not what was said, but who said it. Because external voices carry a different kind of weight. They are not bound by emotional attachment. They do not share history. They are not influenced by familiarity. Which means they can say things that insiders cannot easily say. Even when those things are incomplete or unverified. After the encounter, nothing immediately changed in visible terms. There was no documented confrontation. No immediate breakdown of communication. No recorded escalation. But internally, something had shifted. Because once a statement like that enters thought, it does not exit easily. It repeats. It reappears in quiet moments. It attaches itself to memory. Not as fact, but as possibility. She returned to her routine. But routine no longer felt identical. Not because anything external had changed, but because interpretation had. The same interactions now carried additional weight. The same behaviors were now being observed differently. And observation changes emotional experience more than events themselves. Importantly, there was no immediate change in him. No visible shift in behavior documented in this phase. He remained consistent. Present in the same way he had been before. Calm. Controlled. Unreactive. But consistency itself began to take on new meaning. Because once doubt is introduced, even stability can be reinterpreted. Not as safety, but as concealment. What makes external warnings powerful is not their accuracy. It is their discomfort. They do not integrate smoothly into existing emotional narratives. They interrupt them. And that interruption forces internal evaluation. Even when the decision is ultimately to reject the warning, the evaluation still occurs. An evaluation changes perception permanently. After the encounter, one question began to persist internally. Not because it had been confirmed, but because it had been introduced. What if there is something I don't know? This is not a conclusion. It is an opening. And openings are where emotional instability begins to grow. When external claims threaten emotional stability, the natural response is defense. Not always confrontation. Often rationalization. Reinterpretation. Reduction of importance. Because accepting uncertainty is more difficult than maintaining familiarity. There are endings that arrive with noise. Sirens. Court rulings. Public statements. Final confirmations that close a story with certainty. And then there are endings that arrive quietly. No celebration. No relief that feels complete. No emotional resolution that matches expectation. Just absence. And reflection. This was the second kind. The legal process had reached its conclusion. Details had been reviewed. Statements had been examined. Decisions had been made. And in the end, he was taken away from the life he had built within the story. Not in a dramatic sense for those watching from the outside, but in a procedural sense that still carried emotional weight for those directly connected. There was no final conversation recorded between them that defined closure. No cinematic farewell. No last exchange designed to provide meaning. Only separation. What follows after resolution is not always peace. Sometimes it is emptiness. Because structure, no matter how complicated, provides orientation. It gives emotional reference points. It allows people to define themselves in relation to something stable. And when that structure is removed, orientation disappears with it. In the immediate aftermath, she did not return to public narrative. There were no statements attempting to reframe events. No visible effort to control interpretation. No attempt to rebuild identity through explanation. Instead, there was withdrawal. Not physical disappearance, but emotional retreat from interpretation by others. And that absence created space for something else. Reflection. One of the most significant changes in this final phase is internal role reversal. For most of the narrative, she existed within events. Responding. Choosing. Continuing. Re-evaluating. But now, she becomes an observer of those same events. Not externally, but internally. Watching her own decisions as if they belong to someone else. And that distance changes perception.